DevilNeverCry.
What is up everyone, it is me DevilNeverCry and you join me today for my review of Wanted Dead. I can finally delay no further, so many of you have been asking me to cover this game and thus here we are. So without further ado, here's Wanted Dead. On paper, Wanted Dead seemed like a game that I would absolutely adore. A hack and slash game made by some of the people behind the Ninja Gaiden series, a fast and frenetic game that promised to blend third-person gunplay alongside melee combat that also harkened back to the days of PS2 games. Sign me right up. But unfortunately, when getting stuck into this game, getting into the fine details, things just didn't add up. This game was on my radar pre-release, and then after seeing all of the reviews dropped, it seemed like Marmite, a case of you either love it or you absolutely hate it. On that premise alone, I decided to get stuck into the game myself and come to my own conclusions. First off, let's talk about the narrative, which seems to be a large point of contention, but mainly in how the narrative is essentially displayed to the player. You play as Officer Stone. Set in a dystopian world, Officer Stone is the lieutenant of Zombie Squad, a squad seemingly made up of war criminals turned police officers, whose freedom is only granted to them provided that they actually go out and dish out justice. As expected, mayhem and destruction lies in their wake everywhere they go, and their hard-boiled captain continuously chews them out after their repeated failures. As you go about completing each mission, there is some loose semblance of a plot, but unfortunately, it's not really presented to the player all too well, and the game doesn't really do a good job of making you care about these characters or even Zombie Squad altogether. The main issue that people seem to have is with the tonal whiplash of this game. The game will be playing a cutscene at one point before thrusting you into an inconsequential minigame, then into an anime sequence, back into a cutscene and then into gameplay, and repeat ad nauseum. As somebody who doesn't mind weird, quirky and out there segments in games, this didn't bother me all too much. The game sold itself on its promise of jank and it definitely delivered, but I can definitely see why this would put a lot of people off. I definitely do think things could have been presented better, but in all honesty, I was more interested in the gameplay, as were most people that were likely playing this game. First off, to keep things somewhat positive, let's talk about all of the things that I liked about the combat of Wanted Dead. Kicking things off with the execution moves. Enemies can be put into a state of vulnerability through sustained gunfire or melee attacks, where Stone will be able to insta-kill them. She'll pull out an intricate finishing move, which will allow her to completely obliterate her enemies, and if there are others in the vicinity who are vulnerable, you're able to chain this mechanic. These are cool to look at, and they are cathartic to pull off. I mentioned parries just then, which is another mechanic of Wanted Dead that I like. The parry here is tight and engaging enough to where a player will actually have to figure out what enemies are doing and time their parry accordingly if they want to succeed. Haphazardly throwing out a parry attempt will often lead you to just taking immediate damage, as that's how tight the window of parrying is. Another positive aspect of Wanted Dead that I liked was the dismemberment system, an ultimate throwback of course to Ninja Gaiden 2, which featured this quite prominently. By attacking enemies with her katana, Stone is able to dismember enemies, allowing enemies to alter their tactics slightly and sometimes becoming even more dangerous if left unattended. And that's about where my enjoyment with Wanted Dead unfortunately perishes. Let's get onto some of the things that are questionable and could have been executed, to be honest, a whole lot better. First up is the melee combat. An aspect of this game that was touted as a core feature was focused on quite prominently, but ultimately falls short of other games like Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, God of War, etc. This game only has one playable character. This character only has one melee weapon, being the katana, and this katana only has 2 combo strings, one of which can be upgraded to add 1 or 2 more hits to it, but that's essentially it. From the start of the game all the way to the very end of the game, you'll be using the same 2 combos throughout, leading it to feel repetitive and unfortunately quite boring at times. Couple these shallow melee mechanics alongside melee that doesn't feel fun to use, in fact it feels quite sluggish and quite janky, and it doesn't make for a fun experience unfortunately. But that's only supposed to be one part of the game, you tell yourself. You've also got the shooting mechanics to talk about, right? And unfortunately, things don't get much better there. At any point in combat, you're able to switch to an over-the-shoulder point of view where Stone will be able to gun down her enemies. Unfortunately, all of the weapons she's able to use feel like absolute pea shooters, as enemies sit there like bullet sponges, taking a plethora of attacks before all of a sudden perishing. There's no punch behind the guns at all. Enemies barely even react to being shot until they're pretty much dead. The game does a good job of throwing different mixes of enemies at you, some of which will stand back and shoot at you, others who will rush you to attack you in melee, but ultimately they feel tedious to fight against as opposed to fun overall. Moving on, we come to one of my biggest gripes with the game, and that is the upgrade system. As previously mentioned, the finishing moves feel like some of the most cathartic things that you can do in this game, and unfortunately a lot of the major mechanics behind it are tied off through an upgrade system. Specifically, the upgrades that allow you to execute enemies that have been dismembered. Why this was locked off midway into the upgrade tree, I'll never know. If you actually take a look at a game, for example, like DevilNeverCry, and you look at the upgrade system, you'll realize that it's meticulously been thought out. Typically, the bang for your buck moves, or moves that essentially enhance the player experience quite considerably, are often put right at the beginning of a skill tree, allowing players to unlock those moves almost immediately, having a large positive impact on their gameplay, with often some of the more advanced or potentially inconsequential moves being locked off more towards the end of the skill tree, which requires obviously more currency to buy them. Unfortunately, there is no balance in the skill tree in Wanted Dead whatsoever, or seemingly that's what it looks like. This is also bolstered unfortunately by the fact that by the time I got to the final chapter, not even the end, but the final chapter of Wanted Dead, after having bought every skill available to me, I was still swimming in an overabundance of skill points. Typically in hack and slash games, they don't give you enough points to buy everything in the skill list in one playthrough to often encourage you to go back and play again, perhaps even on New Game Plus. But that unfortunately doesn't seem to be the case here whatsoever. Another aspect of this game that's worth talking about that some people have had issues with is the archaic checkpoint system. When in a mission, the game will only save your progress at certain intervals whenever you come across a drone. These intervals can be spaced quite close together and at often other times quite far apart, meaning that you can go through wave after wave of enemies, die to something and then be put back a considerable amount. Typically this would be manageable and not too much of an issue, even if there are harder and tougher games out there that pride themselves on their difficulty, that do a better job of respecting the player's time and giving them more thought out checkpoints. But this game has enemies that will literally one-shot you with grenade launchers the moment they see you walking into a room, meaning that sometimes you are subject to cheap deaths that you had no way of avoiding. I think what's so infuriating about this as well is that sometimes the damage enemies do can be rather inconsistent. Sometimes enemies will throw a grenade that's miles away from me, that will kill me. Other times you'll have one that lands right next to you, which will do minuscule damage. And my entire experience with Wanted Dead, warts and all, everything I liked, disliked, was all made worse by the terrible performance issues that I was facing. For context, I was playing on a PS5. And I suffered through multiple crashes, some of which were even on stream. In fact, I had 2 of them happen in the span of 30 minutes. And it's not like the game was doing anything intensive. One of which happened whilst it was loading a cutscene, and the other happened whilst I was loading a save after I died. Then we have the considerable frame rate drops that happen every time the game threatens to get just a little bit hectic. And to top it all off, I had a few trophies fail to unlock, one of which being the karaoke one where I had to max out the adrenaline bar. I did that over and over countless times and I got absolutely nothing. The developers are aware of all of the feedback and issues that the community has had with this game and they are working on a potential fix. But we are a month on from release now and issues are still quite prevalent. Hence my review and ultimately my feelings on Wanted Dead. The game does have a level of charm, a potential for promise, but ultimately that is all brought down by the combat mechanics or lack thereof and overall the performance issues that I faced. I'm not one to give out numerical review scores, as honestly I think the video pretty much speaks for itself, but what I can say is that I unfortunately do not recommend Wanted Dead until at least the developers have gone in and patched all of the issues that the game currently faces. And so there you have it, that is my review of Wanted Dead. I tried to be as fair as possible in my analysis. If there is something you agree or disagree with, do let me know down in the comments below. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.